and bad jumbling together, I think, going on there.
Just interested at this point I mean, a lot of people will be quite cynical about the big society at this time of economic, crisis, and there isn't any money, and they would say it's just an excuse, really, to cut back in public spending. But what you're saying, all of you, really, is there is something more substantive than that. I mean, it's not just, a cynical government ploy, nor is it mainly just, a purpose to reinvent the Conservative Party. I mean, that's part of it. But there's something which is, broader, more deeper. What it's trying to do, how it's trying to engage with the society. Francesco, what do you think?
I totally agree. In fact, I must say that the financial crisis is a big opportunity for big society. So I wouldn't see a necessary problem there. Because I do believe that, number one, the argument of economies of scale, as a quote-unquote economist, the argument of the state having an advantage of economies of scale in terms of providing public services is very much an overrated argument. And by the way, it was an argument for a completely different age, an industrial age, not the time we are living now. Number two, because there is an economies of knowledge, of knowing the problems and the needs of the people when you are at the front line with your clients, or when you are the clients that can manufacture himself the service to be provided. So from a pure financial economic point of view, there may be a rather significant value that can be used with big society. But if I can tell you also something else, which is not an economic argument, but it's a problem of politics, probably of a political theory, which is your. The idea of subsidiarity is, at the end of the day, an idea that requires to turn upside down the pyramid completely. It's a complete, if you do allocate the policy, the service at the lowest possible level, as documents which are quite important because they are constitution, this means to practically completely change upside down the distribution of power in the power of political power, economic power. And it is funny that in a country like Italy, and I think the same experience may happen in UK as well, they have been very quick in devolving policies, tasks, public services to regions and to local constituencies. For instance, healthcare systems are run by the region in a country like Italy. However, they have been much slower and much more resistant to do the other side of the coin of the process, which is to transfer to the regions, to the local council, also the money. They basically the state still retains 92% of the tax revenues and then transfer money to the region, which is completely different from what should be done if we also do the second part of the process, the so-called fiscal federalism, which is also to give the financial autonomy to the regions. That is a very serious restructuring of the power in a society. And there is, of course, a huge resistance to rewrite the social contract of a society and to forgo power from the central structure. I think this is the problem.
I just want to take up something that Mike mentioned a while ago, and Mike has written about representation and democracy, and the big society does talk a lot about citizen participation. Talks about the need to make politicians and public servants accountable. We had this parliamentary expenses scandal, and in Italy something even more serious. And so is it inevitable, Mike, that the big society will lead to a bigger democracy?
That's a bigger question than most. I don't know what a bigger democracy could mean. I could imagine what that phrase means in geographical or territorial terms. I can, however, imagine what a more kind of densely networked democracy is. I can imagine what a more decentralized democracy might be. And so whether democracy the texture of democracy could be thickened and improved by the big society, I think is interesting. And it's interesting, going back to the earlier point as well, very much in the context of the UK. Don't forget, of course, the UK is one of the most extraordinarily centralized, in terms of political power, extraordinarily centralized states anywhere across the world. It's extraordinarily centralized because of the doctrine of the sovereignty of Parliament, ultimately. Going back to a comment just made, local government does not have independent financial powers. It is dependent upon central government from whatever tax-raising revenue or autonomous capacity to act that it has. This is a unitary state, not a federal state. I'm not telling you things you don't know, but all of these things add up together to remind us how extraordinarily centralized British democracy is. I don't hesitate to call it democracy, but it's an extraordinarily thin and centralized democracy in many ways. Now, well, what is democracy? I still don't know how to answer that question. I've written 2 books on the subject, and the first one offered an answer, and the second one offered reasons why you better be careful about any answer you offer. But there are lots of meanings to democracy. You've got to decide what your fundamental value. I will get back to the big society in just one second. You've got to decide what your value is. You ask people on the street, democracy is really about equality. Okay. Democracy is really about freedom. Fine. It's really about accountability. Yeah, accountability. That's 3rd principle. No, it's about participation. There's 4. It's about rights. There's 5. How many more do we need? And these things are not always compatible with each other in theory or in practice. They overlap. In other words, what is democracy is a very simple question that demands a complex answer and a fairly nuanced kind of answer. But there is one if you are constructing that list of democratic principles and thinking about which one matters most and why, the one that matters least in the practice of UK politics, arguably, is decentralisation, which has been mentioned a couple of times already. The decentralisation, perhaps in the form of subsidiarity, is a lost principle, or at least for many decades has been largely a lost principle of democracy in the UK, which is where I try and come back a bit more directly to the question, perhaps, and I think the idea does need to be taken seriously, the big society generally, whatever reasons, and there are reasons for cynicism, and even more reasons to be critical as social scientists or in many other ways. So could a robust, more or less autonomous, more democratic, more rooted in the local community, better led local government in the UK result? That would be one ideal end for the big society discourse and practices. The big concern there would again be the centralised state. Now David Cameron has said, we use the state to remake society. I'm probably not quoting the speech right, but it's pretty close to that. You know, we're going to use the state to devolve. We're going to use the state to create enabling at the local level. We're going to use it. My question would be, does the state know when to let go? Does the central state know when to let go? Does it have the capacity, given British culture, for example, and the centralised state in British history, have the capacity to let go? I'm painting a kind of broad picture here so as not to take too much time. So centralist means of bringing about the big society make it difficult to think in terms of decentralist democratic ends. I wouldn't want to put it too much more strongly than that. But if you give me another 20 seconds, there is a tradition of thinking, which has been hinted at already by Georgina, of thinking about democracy in the UK, which has largely been lost. It was important in the Guild Socialist movement, for example, around World War I. The writers like G.D.H. Cole, like some of the early Fabians, not so much then, but some of the early Fabians. And this is the pluralist tradition. Some of you may know of the work of Paul Hirst, who died 5 or 6 years ago, but was a very key British pluralist writer, reviving these traditions, which had been largely lost from around the time of the First World War. And this is a tradition that does stress the fact that you must let local communities and local voluntary groups and mutuals and others do their own thing, provide their own services. If people don't like the service provided by this group, they can exit and go to another group or form another group. And this is a genuinely decentralizing, almost anti-statist, democratic, British democratic decentralist tradition. It's one that doesn't get mentioned in the big society debates much. Why? Because it's an idea that comes out of the labour movement, I suspect. I may be too cynical there. But it's an idea that's associated very closely with the British version of socialism and the labour movement. So there are potentially revivable traditions, and they need to be thought about in the context of centralism, which remains pervasive.
If I can just reiterate, but probably I'm reiterating, but this is very, very true for Italy. I don't like the idea that the state enables big society, and I don't like the idea of empowerment. Empowering who? You may already be able to have the power, and therefore it's easier to use the word freedom. No, of course, if you are taking as a community, you are taking over a policy. This comes with responsibility. It's not just some prize, with work, with competence, with know-how. But then it's up to you to decide that it's you the more efficient level where that policy can be more conveniently being exercised. So I will not. There is a risk here that we will have to create some big audit office or some big statistical unit to measure the performance of. Instead, it's very much about democracy in the sense of letting people to do what they need to do if they decide that they are able to do it, in a sense. Also because it's quite illogical that the state will kill itself. Very much regardless if it's conservative or progressive. This technocracy, bureaucracy, technocracy is too much of a word, regardless of the politicians that are running them for 5 or 4 years, have a capability to survive that is incredible.
Can I just come in? On the way up, I was reading an article in a magazine which was talking not about the enabling state but about the nudging state. We're kind of, sort of moving on to that now, which it was even less clear, I think, than the big society, but it kind of seemed to be about sort of putting the right kind of structures in place to enable to enable individuals to make the right decisions themselves, rather than having the nanny state tell them to kind of eat 5 a day and all the rest of it. But kind of given what Mike was saying about the sort of UK central state, it's probably going to be an almighty shove rather than a nudge which kind of occurs. But a kind of more serious point, I do think there are kind of serious dilemmas arise when the state is kind of involved in encouraging democratic participation. On the one hand, I think it does have a role in doing that. But I think defining that role is very, very difficult. And the state doesn't know when to stop. And kind of work I did in Barcelona on sort of local democracy shows that, even where you have an incredibly enabling local state, which really does try to facilitate spaces of participation, the kind of participation that you end up with becomes very sterile, it becomes very professionalized, and it kind of very much loses any kind of radical critical edge. So there's kind of real problems, I think, involved in doing that.
Thanks. We're going to open it up very shortly. Just before we do that, I want to just go slightly beyond Britain and ask Francesco. Obviously, the big society has emerged at a time when there are many movements across the world that have opposed statist solutions. If you think of the Tea Party movement in the US, and these movements are very populist. I mean, they're, it's an opposition to the state, which is, if you like, very, very populist. Is the big society really part of a wider populist discontent with the state. Also in Italy, you have many populist movements.
Now, big society, of course, is very much part of a very widespread, if not worldwide, Europe and US wide spread discontent with the state. This is by sure. I would not entirely agree saying that this discontent is populist all the time. Because, I mean, this is very much true for Italy. And it's not just simply a question of big society. If we have to rest on the assumption that the state is better to provide public services and to make the picture a little bit broader, if we still have to rest on the assumption, which is quite funny in Italy, that politicians are better than non-politicians to take collective decision, in that case, I wouldn't say that it's populist to think that this is completely a fake assumption. No, there is the short answer, there is a huge discontent, but I wouldn't say that it's necessarily populist, whereas the Tea Party movement in America has been populist. So there are risks in this discontent because talking about Italy, the Northern League and even Berlusconi, as we discussed in another conference here in...
Let's talk a bit about Berlusconi, not much, but a little bit. Well, at least Italy. But on the one hand, you know, the Italian political system is very lacking transparency. I mean, the Italian political class is renowned for not being accountable. It's the most highly paid, untouchable. You know, politicians, you know, depart and they return in another party. So it's not just about the Italian prime minister who needs 80 lawyers to keep him out of jail, and it's something more, you know, fundamental to the system. But on the other hand, it's a society which is rich in civil society traditions. Even now, many of the movements are there in civil society. So you could see, you know, from, you know, the comics and the film directors who seem to be the opposition, doesn't seem to be any other opposition, you know, who are campaigning. You could see then maybe an idea of big society or not. I mean, this idea taking shape, because the state is not trusted in Italy, I mean, even on the left.
Certainly Italy has got the potential for being a big society. But the reality, this is for two reasons. One, that the state is really delegitimized. And number two, because there is a tradition. However, there is another concept which is quite clear if you look to Italy, that even big society, as it is a natural consequence of the subsidiarity principle, is something that we have to think about, something which is very flexible. Because there are, for instance, in Italy this is very, very clear, there are areas where there are the condition for big society to happen, and other areas which are very, very far from such a thing. And this is also very much applies to different policies. So you can also imagine a matrix with policies and regions with very many different flexible geometries of distribution of power, which is also something which has to be, which probably is important even here. No, decentralization is not a blanket measure that you do with some reform, you know, one day, which is valid for Wales and Scotland are two completely different places, and therefore big society idea very much requires flexibility.
Thanks. Okay, so now we're going to open it up, and Julia's got a roving microphone. Okay, so if you'd like to make a contribution, let us know. Please tell us who you are, and we'll take about, we'll take three, let's say three, contributions in one go. Rick, have you got your hand up there? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you got a loud enough voice actually, but we'll use the mic anyway.
That was really interesting discussion.
No, I think you need the mic for yeah.
I've been so busy marking DD 101 that I've not really got into the big society debate yet. But it's really interesting discussion, and it sort of opened up all sorts of ideas for me. But round here, I mean, I work in Staffordshire, and what's happening at the moment is they've disbanded the Regional Development Agency, and they're now starting a whole new, sort of sub-regional kind of level of kind of governance is emerging. But you haven't mentioned the private sector really, and part of this financial stringency thing is that the government is wanting the private sector to deliver, in the future to meet growth targets. And the way they seem to be, I don't know whether they're doing that anyway or whether it would have happened anyway, but the shadow boards of these local enterprise partnerships are totally dominated by the private sector. For me, it's disappointing because I used to be in university, now I'm a small self-employed person, but I see, the chair of Michelin, the chair of a big pottery manufacturer, the shadow board for a local enterprise partnership is supposed to be about, local autonomy. So to me, it's quite interesting to see how the private sector intertwines with local sort of democracy as part of this debate, really.
Thanks, Rick. Anyone else like to come in? Yeah.
Come in on that.
Yeah. We'll just pass the mic over.
I'm John Doswell. I'm DD 101 student. Been in business all my life, so academic study is quite new to me. Georgina said at the beginning that there were 3 resources needed: time, money, and effort. And in business, one might add a thing called motivation. It seems to me that there's not much money. I mean, we've talked about the decimation of the local budgets, which sort of leaves time and effort for individuals. And you talked about the enabling state. Well, that's a very passive concept in that it puts something there, but it doesn't actually motivate. And Francis Moore talked about mutualization, and John Lewis, where there clearly is motivation for those people in terms of the perks and the profit sharing and so on. But where in this big society is the motivation for people and individuals to actually want to do it? The old labour movement you talked about, the motivation there was quite clear because people were part of a community which was poor and it was defending the working classes. But these days, there isn't that, and there's a sort of middle class element to this thing. So my question is, for the big society, where is the motivation?
Thank you. One more in this batch. Hugh Mackay, yeah. Okay.
I'm Hugh Mackay in sociology and work for the OU in Cardiff. And one point that I wanted to mention, almost in passing, was that we heard about how centralised, if monolithic, the state was. And of course, coming from Wales, it doesn't look entirely like that. And that there have been, in recent years, in a sense surprisingly, strong moves to counter that very, very long and deep-rooted tradition of a particular version of a centralised state. But those differences between Edinburgh, Cardiff and Westminster are certainly growing almost by the day. The powers of the Parliament and the Assembly are increasing, and they're becoming confined to more than the symbolic, the free prescriptions and no league tables in schools. And there's various other ways in which these nations are kind of establishing their political priorities as, you could say fundamentally, but certainly distinctly different from those of Westminster. The main point I want to make, though, is about local empowerment. And what's particularly strange about the rhetoric of local empowerment, as people have said, is that it's accompanied by something approaching the abolition of local government. So local government is taking the biggest hit in the budget cuts. Schools are being completely taken out of, in England, not in Wales or Scotland, being completely taken out of local authority control. Now, that's reversing kind of 130 years of history or something of that order. So the powers, the budgets, the control, the significance of local authorities is going to be dramatically reduced. You go down to that housing, the end of new build of, well, I mean, it's been a process, this, but it's almost like the last nail in the coffin for local authority housing coming in at the moment. So at the same time as empowering local communities, that's the rhetoric, you've got the demolition of, or attack on the structures of democratic local accountability. And to put it mildly, that's kind of paradoxical. So certainly to me, at least, it seems that the big society is something which doesn't run counter to a central state. You've still got the central state, but it certainly runs counter to a whole panoply of local democratic institutions, and it's about the individualisation of society, perhaps. So, under the rhetoric of big society, it's you've got a process of individualisation and attack on institutions which actually bring people together. Because as somebody has already said, it's not just local government, but it's also the whole voluntary sector, which in a variety of ways is funded by, lives off local government, not just in providing services, but local engagement, and that too is going to take a very big proportion of the hit that's going to arrive next year.
Okay, thanks. We'll get some comments on those 3 points. Anybody? Private sector?
Could I
Mike.
have a go at linking two of them? Hugh's point and was it Rick's at the beginning? It's about maybe all three. I'm not sure I believe this, but let me try and sell you something. You know, this is the big society is an idea that has many sides. Many of them don't really. The jigsaw doesn't really fit together, at least not yet. The rhetoric is interesting. The ideas are worth taking seriously. But let me sell you a vision of it, which takes care of the democracy problem, takes care of the business problem, maybe takes care of some others. You're right, Hugh, if democracy is about voting. What do we think democracy is about? Voting. It's having votes locally, it's having votes nationally, it's having votes at European level, it's having perhaps votes within other bodies and organisations around us. But voting is a species of choosing. And what if you didn't necessarily vote, but you could choose in other ways? You could choose, for example, to go to this local service provider with regard to education, housing, or social services, or you could choose to go for that one. In other words, you don't vote for them, but you vote with your feet. Okay? And this may be a version of democratic choice in itself. You can exit from one, you can go to another. So in that sense, empowered, even if elected local government either doesn't exist anymore, or it's just a shell, and it's able to achieve very little, has very little legitimacy, or very little independent resources. So you have a series of local providers who provide welfare, schooling, housing, other benefits and other services. These are funded by a central government, but central government then leaves them alone to get on with it. There is some accountability down the line, but the checks are handed over. And as long as certain minimal conditions are fulfilled, churches and schools and groups of parents and all sorts of groups of people